record. I'm going to introduce Esther. As you know, because I just presented, I did my PhD, finished last year, and this book, Art and Mourning, was a really important book for me to reference. Written by Dr. Esther Dreifuss-Kattan. So Esther is a psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, and art therapist in Beverly Hills, California.
At this point, it's not Beverly Hills anymore, but close.
Okay, it's in California. I'm going to read this blurb about you, so you may have to go to the website and correct it. She works with adults all ages, adolescents and children, and given her own artistic background, she specializes in helping clients who are involved in various creative pursuits and/or who work in the entertainment industry or art world, film, television, etc. Her second speciality is working with adult and pediatric cancer patients and survivors and their families, as well as those with chronic pain. In addition to her private practice, she also works extensively with Los Angeles-based organizations devoted to treating those with illness. She's a senior faculty member at the New Center for Psychoanalysis. Joining us from California to talk about her book, Art and Mourning, and how artists have used their creativity to face and work through traumatic and painful experiences of loss. As a psychoanalyst, art therapist, and artist, Esther has analyzed the work of major modernist and contemporary artists and thinkers through her psychoanalysis lens. So welcome, Esther. Thank you very much for joining us. I have got some slides on my screen that I'm going to show as Esther directs me to do that. So I don't know how you can make my screen bigger to see those. So I hope that works. But you just shout when you want me to do that, Esther. And otherwise, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. It's a real pleasure and a first to be in any way connected to Tasmania. So I will read a paper, and my accent is from Zurich, Switzerland, with 30 years of English after that and some Hebrew in between. So in case you can't understand me, just let me know, and I do it less fast or whatever it is you need, because it's always strange on Zoom, the whole thing. I will today talk about Louise Bourgeois. I give you an introduction. It is with great pleasure to meet you all today on the other side of the world and talk about art, trauma, and mourning. We all find ourselves in a traumatic situation with the worldwide COVID-19 pandemic. Here in the US, it's all encompassing. And without making my daily collages and paintings, I could not make it. I can throw my mask, which we have to wear at all times, particularly in New York and in California, around the room and decide to be in my own world, the one I reimagine each day, inspired both in the here and now, as well as in my past. I also do see now on Zoom patients who cannot come to me. While I'm familiar with several kinds of traumata, working with bipolar and schizophrenic patients in the 1970s in the US, then without psychotropic medication, or with men who suffered from AIDS and HIV in Tel Aviv, Israel, and through the Actors Fund here in Hollywood. And since 30 years with cancer patients, first in the University Hospital in Zurich, Switzerland, and now at the Sinsman UCLA Center for Integrative Oncology. In this pandemic, I lead a weekly Zoom art therapy group with adult cancer patients through this UCLA program. And I see regularly 8 to 10 patients. Given that we work with Zoom now, actually we invite whole regions who can now participate, which wouldn't be able to come actually to the center in normal situations. which is pretty interesting. Trauma has many faces, as you all just showed me, for different people, but most can be worked through with the help of art, which you know as well as me. Be it through art therapy, music, dance, composing poetry, or art psychotherapy. For this talk today, I chose Louise Bourgeois, the French multimedia artist who lived most of her life in New York City and created art to the age of 98. Does somebody, are you familiar with this artist? Yes, some are, and the others will be. To cope with reality of time and its passing, and the wish to transcend finiteness, artists often employ artistic medium. Artistic narrative is the medium of temporality in Louise Bourgeois' late sculptural work, and move between memory, trauma, and compulsive reenactment. Choosing the circular rather than the sequential time in some of her later sculpture, created during the extreme old age, Bourgeois invoked a sense of being in the present in spite of infusing form with personal memories and artifacts from her traumatic and haunting childhood. When one looks at her art, trying to understand the meaning, one is placed in the present of viewing. Her sculptural narrative, as well as her narrative memory, becomes her medium of temporality. In 2004, Jerry, Louise's longtime assistant, discovered also boxes filled of her own writing. And these were actually 1,000 loose pages. These texts complemented her existing diaries, letters, and memorabilia of her early life. She made use of psychoanalysis after her father died, as she had used art making after the death of her mother in 1932. The content of the loose sheets demonstrate how her art would transform her psychoanalysis and how psychoanalysis transformed her art. All in an attempt to repair herself from the injuries of her traumatic childhood. I will quote from some of these newly discovered loose sheets within. Can everybody see me? Is everything okay? Okay. The editor of the first volume published with some of these loose sheets says in the introduction, I quote, "The artifacts she kept between clothes, letters, photographs, or scraps of tapestry possessed talismanic power to conjure up the past and thereby ward off forgetfulness, loss, and death." As we read these recovered sheets, like process notes, we find free association, dream, symptoms, memories, and poem-like writing, but we are consistently confronted with Bourgeois' lifelong deep fear of abandonment that she understood as a reaction to the frequent absence of her father during World War I, later because of work and multiple mistresses and mother's long illness and early death. It becomes clear reading these published notes, interviews, and diaries that psychoanalysis made new knowledge and insight available to her that in turn informed her art. We could say it's kind of an autobiographic, reflective art practice, an art of subjectivity that engaged with aggression, longing, fear of separation, mourning, feminism, and early, when it wasn't fashionable yet, like today, motherhood, domestic and social life. It allowed the artist to a certain extent to restore and to repair herself that seemed badly damaged in her early traumatic childhood. I give you some biographic information. She was born in 1911 in Paris, the second of 3 children into a family of artists, restorers of antique tapestries. Here she is as a young woman. In spite of a young brother, her father came to adore her. Her maternal lineage was rooted in Aubusson, in the heart of France, founded in the 16th century by tapestry manufacturers. Aubusson was located near a river, ideal for the washing and dyeing of wool. Her grandmother had her own workshop, and later her mother did as well. So she comes from a lineage of strong women. After the turn of the century, her father Louis discovered the value of old, tattered, medieval and Renaissance tapestries, which they then restored and later sold. After her mother became ill with the Spanish flu, that was the last pandemic, and later with tuberculosis, Louise's father became a philanderer. In 1922, when Louise was 10 years old, Sadie was hired as Louise's English tutor and soon became father's mistress. Sadie lived in the family's home until mother's death in 1932. Louise took care of her ailing mother. Quote, "I was definitely relieved by her death, and I put myself in her bed," writes Louise Bourgeois in 1959, while in psychoanalysis. Louise Bourgeois, it seemed to be for her, it seemed to have been a symbolic reenactment of her incestuous wishes for her father. While Louise saw herself on the one hand to be a favorite child of her parents, she also suffered from father's sadistic teasing and his openly sexual reference towards her. A few years at the Sorbonne, she studied math first. I thought that was pretty interesting. As she began to, and then after 2 years, she changed to painting and sculpture with many well-known artists in Paris. She worked in the studios of Fernand Léger, among others. She was also close to the Surrealists in Paris, and in 1938, she married an American art historian, Robert Goldwater, and moved with him to New York City. He was become a professor at New York University. Bourgeois set her own rules in her artistic practice, addressing gender and sexuality, exploring outside as well as her internal narrative and imagery. Her artistic path from 1940 to 70 was recognized as a more subversive one. She was always ready for change and moved from a modernist tradition to postmodernism. That is really quite amazing how this woman went with the flow till 97. She began to show her personages starting in 1960. Maybe we could show that picture for a while here since I talk about it. Her art slowly became more recognized at that time at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, later at the Whitney Museum of New York, And later she represented, in 1993, she represented the Venice Biennale. She represented the US in the Venice Biennale. And she had finally, in 2007, her retrospective at the Tate Modern in London. As you might all know, it was extremely difficult for women artists to get anywhere in terms of A, exhibiting, and B, having retrospective till not too long ago. A quote here from her: "Art is the guarantee of sanity." Most probably all could empathize with this sentence. She wrote it in her installation, addressing her need to keep creating in order to deal with her traumatic past and later with her old age. Bourgeois' obsession with her early childhood, trauma, and the theme of her family has been the focal point and root of most of her creative work for the last 27 years. This text describes and illustrates her archetypal childhood trauma when, as mentioned, no, that's the wrong picture. Okay, we stay with that for a while. This text describes Louise felt betrayed by her father, mother, and especially Sadie, who destroyed what she retrospectively perceived as a family idyll. Quote, "Everything I do is inspired by my life," says the artist, quote. "My name is Louise Bourgeois. All my work I've done and all the subject I've ever worked on find their source in my childhood." In 92, when Bourgeois was 92 years old, she writes in one of her loose sheets, which is really interesting. She was 92 at that time. She writes, "Louise is the child who runs away in search of another family, still looking." Now I'll talk a little bit more about these personages. This one word I can't say in English, sorry. Some of her early sculpture work revealed the mourning she experienced for her mother and moving away from France, leaving her family and friends behind. She called her life-sized wood sculpture, where you see there, from 1941, Personages. The artist called this slim wood sculpture, which can stand alone or in groups, a memorial. She comments, "I was missing certain people I left behind. It was a tangible way of recreating a missed past." These slender posts and planks were made of balsa wood on the scale of a human body and painted black, white, and red. Titles such as Dragger Child, Portrait of Jean-Louis, that was her adoptive son, they were set directly onto the floor without base. They looked unstable and about to fall and might illustrate the artist's inability at this time to keep her psychic balance. The sculptor cut the wood, carved and hammered nail into some of the poles in an attempt to symbolically transform her aggression towards herself and others. Bourgeois was not, it was very difficult to have a relationship with her. She had no relationship with other artists, working artists at the time. Bourgeois, influenced early in her career by the Cubist and Surrealist artist friends, told her friend Pierre Matisse and Marcel Duchamp that her Personages sculptures were a manifestation of her homesickness. The hammering, chiseling, and scrapping of these totemic forms allowed the artist to exorcise her rage that was fostered by being forced to sever this attachment from her past. These portable brothers, as she calls them, are set in a ritualistic manner in the exhibition room, demonstrating relationships with each other and with the viewer, and become surrogates for those who were missing. When the artist was asked in an interview in 2003 what her biggest losses are, she responded that the loss of her husband in 1973, the loss of her mother in 1932. When asked about the biggest fear, she answered, absence of the other, the fear of losing. This is very important to me. Evanescent gives birth to the fear of losing. So now we can go to Untitled 1996, the next picture, which is not the one you showed me, no, the one in between, I guess. The one, not this, not this, not this, yeah, not this, not this, not this, not this, no. There is one upper one, under one. Yeah, that's it. Sorry. In her two, let's see where I am. Okay. First, I talk about the sculptures in general, the two. In her two sculptures, I will show you, I show you them both afterwards, Untitled 1996. The 86-year-old Louise Bourgeois expressed a counterforce against the chronology and the linear unfolding of time. By presenting found objects from her real and imagined past, Bourgeois forced the viewer to confront both her memory and her trauma. As a viewer, one becomes engaged with the three-dimensional sculpture work in a shared space of mourning, in some kind of a circular viewing. When I saw this sculpture first exhibited in the museum, I walked around for about half an hour. The sculpture, the Untitled, presents the branches of a metal tree with hangers made of cow bones hanging from them clothes from a time past, such as undergarments with lace, silk, slips, and a black beaded cocktail dress are neatly draped over the kettlebone hangers. Along with children's undershirts, a silk blouse with paper stuffed protruding breast, clothes are often referred to as the body's second skin, an additional protection that the artist now sheds in her old age. The clothing is a memento mori for the past time when the feminine slim body was adorned with these useful pieces of clothing. At the same time, the artist illustrates the loss of her past through the manipulation of the dissonant forms of the outside kettlebones hangers, supporting the very delicate remnant of one's young, sexy woman with a beautiful body. Here is her quote. Each garment has a history, a past, a raison d'être. Behind each garment, there is a person, not me. The other example, Robert, that's her husband, the children, Alfred, my mother, friends, jealousy of a girlfriend, verify, relief, the past, its archaeology. Bourgeois wrote on one of the loose sheets in 1995. Now, however, these once delicate pieces of clothing have aged and withered, leaving traces of the past and presenting as objects beyond time. This effectively expresses bourgeois mourning for the time that had passed and are mourning for our own death, the near future. Quote, I am going to cry my garments, and especially my undergarments always have been a source of intolerable suffering because they hide an intolerable wound, writes Louise in 1961. Now this refers again to the trauma of living in the same house with her father, who had a relationship with her English teacher. The oversized bone hangers also symbolize the skeleton beneath the clothing, stripped of its flesh, creating a morbid effect and a ghostly presence, both ironic and deeply moving. The tree, possibly the tree of life, is freestanding, allowing the viewer to walk around it, thus experiencing no physical beginning or ending. Bourgeois fixes her worn and otherness close in the now, in the chronology, in her own chronology. The viewer is directly confronted with the psychic as well as the physical, with the uncanny effect of violence through death and tender vulnerability of the feminine and the erotic. Quote, that's what she wrote. Seamstress, mistress, distress, stress is inscribed into the metal stand to help the viewer understand the biographic traumatic roadmap that informs so many of Louise Bourgeois' late sculpture, expressing the inherent ambivalence of aging. Then we can go to the spider. Okay, that was done in 1997. It's one of many Louise's cell sculptures. These sculptures are very big. They need a whole room, basically. The term cell is a play on the word for the name of the town where Louise grew up in France, Choisy, translated from French as locus of memories. Located in Bourgeois' experience in the cell of her home. The cell also relates to the cells in her body as she repeatedly addresses her childhood trauma, engraving the viewer to partake in her past with all of its psychological and physical dimension. By creating her own architecture, as sculpture or installation, Bourgeois informs the viewer that the cell represents a prison as well as a habitat that goes around and around, housing physical and mental pain. It's a self-contained sculptural structure with the sense of circular time, attempting to integrate, merge, and disintegrate. The cells are about memory, fragility, isolation, and about impermanence as well as mourning. The cell allows the viewers an external view of the partially enclosed interior and thus fosters a distinction between the inside and the outside space. By doing so, the artist addresses the thrill of looking and being looked at. The cell is a resting place for her mind as well as a permeable container for her childhood memories and traumata, both limiting and protecting. The giant spider, which you see on top, that towers over the cell structure is metaphorically weaving a web home. For all stories that are newly perceived and experienced in the present of extreme old age, or as Kristeva put it, quote, a tireless reweaving of the maternal web. The spider protects the cage but looms over it, threatening it as well. The sculpture becomes a psychic inscription that is exteriorized, transforming the trauma of childhood into a dreamlike association from the past that are paradoxically set in the present. In one of her descriptions of her work, Louise explains that the spider relates to her mother, who restored and repaired tapestry that little Louise then mended in her mother's workshop when she was not in school. Needles, thread, distaff, and weaving are all metaphorically linked to spiders that spin their own web and relate to the thread of life, to time that unravels, and to the precariousness of life hanging by a thread, especially for a 95-year-old woman. Reminiscent of her mother's occupation, Bourgeois says, when I was growing up, all women in my house were using needles. The magic power of the needle. The needle is used to repair the damage. It's a claim for forgiveness. It's never aggressive. It's not a pin. Spiders do have an uncanny way of being suddenly present and elicit the image of being both motherly and frightening. Spiders are resilient because they have the power to survive and carry their own architecture on the outside. Like Louise, who often integrated found objects in her sculpture, spiders also built their webs with found objects, fragments of the past. Because Bourgeois focuses on her late sculptures on the passing of time, solitude, and mourning, comes not only with the trauma of the past, but also with aging. The fragility of old age now again searches for the protection of the idealized object, the mother. Fantasies and fear of separation. In the process of creating, artists attain a sense for time that stands still and a longing to fuse with the maternal or the paternal as a defense against the fear of death. Bourgeois transcends the personal through her visual vocabulary and reaches universal themes of trauma, loss, mourning, and new perception. The ability to employ artistic expression to work through mourning and trauma of both physical as well as mental pain due to old age, loss, pandemics, allows the artist to reconnect with his or her good internal object as well as with the experience of time as it connects to these early feelings and to the potential of remembrance. The act of being absorbed within one's creative activity in frequent time sequences throughout the day, weeks, and years represents the rhythmic time. Creating consistently allows the artist to deny or escape the external encroachment of time with its limits and fears, so well documented during the COVID-19 pandemic. Creative expression allows us artists to find a more timeless world when the flux of time and sense of duration seems suspended as the artist feels a complete absorption in being and doing, and can be experienced as a sense of jouissance, as Lacan calls it, a particular enjoyment and pleasure that fosters unity and selfhood in spite of potential life threats or mourning. Then the abyss of loss or death can be bridged by filling it up with the now, which seems outside the flow of time, a transcendence towards the infinite. The successive moments of the creative act can then provide a sense of time standing still with its enveloping eternity. Thanks for all your patience. Now, can we go back and see everybody?
Do you want to just look at the other images, Esther?
Ah, yes. She made so many different beautiful spiders over all her life. This, I think, is in London or something. She always refers to the spiders as a symbol for her mother.
Can I just add something there, Esther? I don't want to analyze the artist's work or anything, but the spider can also represent connections with other people, and often the spider doesn't really have many connections with anybody else because it's so scary.
Right. Yeah, interestingly enough, I guess as Louise Bourgeois became older, she didn't really want any connection, and she for sure didn't want any connection to other women artists. These are her very late work, and they showed that in the Guggenheim Museum in New York City. It was a retrospective of all these handmade, stuffed, incredible things. I mean, I could not believe it when I saw it. It's just unbelievable. And she also made, till the end of her life, she made these things. There are more, I think, on the... she made these things, for example, these look like two bears in one pants or something like this, or something like a child would put into bed before going to sleep, or the mother would put it in the bed for the child. And that night she couldn't sleep. She never slept, this woman. And she always stayed with this helper. I don't know how she would have done anything without him, especially as she lived to 97, and she created till the end of her life. These things look to me a little bit like, especially this, to something to take, like a teddy bear into your bed, not to be alone. But what she did at night, she made drawings. She drew the whole night. So these, she calls her night drawings, or nocturne drawings.
Esther, there was an exhibition of her work in Melbourne a few years ago where they had this work, and they had
and isn't it amazing?
They had the big this work too. They had these. It was at Heidi Gallery in Melbourne. They also had those really new drawings of hers. The red she made when she was sort of 98.
Exactly. Yeah.
Amazing red birthing drawings, weren't they? Were they drawings of birth or?
Yeah, birth, all kind of things. And also these sculptures, she had this beautiful sculpture of a man and a woman lying on some kind of a bed-like thing, one in black and one in white, or different colors. The older creative she got.
All right, thank you. I'm sure there are going to be lots of questions. So
yes. I can't remember, did I read anything about my son?
Well,
anyway.
I think people can just, we'll
Yeah, please feel free to ask. And I'm sorry that I had to read it, but I didn't know how to do it differently.
I'm pretty sure that touched a lot of key points for a lot of, there's a few nodding, certainly for me. I think it's very moving work. So I'm going to take advantage and kick off with the first question and say,
Yes.
when she makes this work, does she retrospectively look at the spider and think, what an interesting object that is, and use the spider as an intuitive thing at the beginning? Or do you think she thinks about what the spider represents before she uses the spider?
You know, that's difficult to say, and whatever I say is only a guess. But she, you know, was altogether about 15 years in psychoanalysis with 2 different psychoanalysts, with a break in between of several years. So I could imagine that some of this imagery came maybe through dreams and free associations, and maybe it was related to a mother, or she associated to be something with the mother. So I would say most probably it was a combination, but I wouldn't know. But once she did it, like with a lot of her art, then she did more of it and bigger and small. And I mean, we have these spiders all over the world. But it's a very good question. You know, what comes from the unconscious, what is really thought through, and what is afterwards associated to it, you know.
I'm also just going to put that image up, Esther, because you sent it to me. So
yes, I just sent this to you because that was my first COVID-19 picture I made. These are cutouts which I painted, and then I painted the canvas and I put it on it because the whole thing got so upsetting. I have two daughters who have 2 families who live, one in New York in the worst outbreak of the entire world, and the other in Philadelphia where it's a little better. So the one way I dealt with it, I just dealt with it through the art. That was, you know, I couldn't do anything. One can't go there, nobody can fly. So there was absolutely nothing to do other than what we all do, from what I hear from you, is to work through our problems, fears, trauma with art, whatever art it is. So that was my way. And since then I made many others. And the same I did a few months earlier, because I wanted to tell that earlier, because we live here in the US, which I'm sure you read the papers too, which is like living in a never-ending trauma. And before that was that immigration trauma, where they, you know, over the Mexican border, they took these people and separated mothers from children and horrific stuff. I made art about that too. So just a way to even do something.
well, if anybody's got questions, I think just jump in and ask.
You said that she disconnected from other artists. Do you know why?
You know, I only know it because of a friend who is an art historian who wrote the book about another artist. And she, I think she was very competitive. She was very difficult to be in a relationship. I don't know, I'm sure not so much with her family, but she had a very hard time. I don't know, was it ambition or fear of people taking her ideas? I have no clue. She was a difficult person.
I had a funny experience one time but it was kind of a poignant moment where I was in a drama workshop, and the man who was a famous director said to us, "You're all here because you're fucked up." And we all kind of were like, well, and I thought it was kind of harsh, but true. And it had me thinking, because I didn't quite believe him. But at the same time, I mean, why were we all artists, you know? I started thinking, and I had another situation where my friend who was a painter said she'd stopped painting, but she didn't really feel the need to paint because she felt everything in her life she had a family and had a daughter, and she was just really happy being a mother. And she felt really whole at the time. And I thought that was really curious as well, because I weaved in and out of that sort of thing. And I don't know, and then with imagination, I think I'm asking about suffering and imagination. And I've found in times in my life that when I suffered most, I was lost in imagination, and imagining things about people, and imagining, not looking at what was real. And I think, so I just have questions about it, because also it's a cultural thing as well. I think imagination is either, you know, real or not real to some people. So I think I guess I'm asking about suffering, but I'm trying to figure out how.
Right.
You know, and I'm watching her and her whole life, and it's like this great art came out of such great suffering. And even the fact that she was suffering, she didn't have close friends or wasn't able to connect with other artists. And I'm just wondering if you could.
Yeah, I think it is very personal, but I do believe that when you do suffer, you have a loss, that art is just an incredible venue to change, to see another side, to focus on your problem, but by not by talking, but by creating. It makes you feel good. I see it now, you know, I have now a Zoom art therapy group. The group I normally have since, I don't know, soon 20 years at UCLA, is a group for all kinds of cancer patients, adult cancer patients in any stage of cancer, or survivors who come once a week for 2 hours for art therapy. And it doesn't cost anything for them. It's a non-for-profit organization. And since we're all now on Zoom, I do the same thing on Zoom now. Now, because it's on Zoom, they can take many more people than they can take different regions of this University of Los Angeles Medical Center, like everywhere has many different hospitals and stuff. They can ask other people to come too. And I have quite a big crowd now, and fortunately a young woman who helps me. And there is a lot going on in this, mostly women's, actually all women at this point, life, because not only are there relative youngish women, not all, but some, who not only were relatively recently diagnosed with cancer, like breast cancer, and had treatment, and all of this is very unpleasant and scary. And now they're also locked in because of COVID-19. And some of the people I didn't know are also locked in alone, you know, in some apartment. They don't have husbands or children or whatever. So it's a trauma on top of a trauma, basically. And just the fact that they want to come and do their thing, and then we talk about each picture, they're totally excited. And it's just how it is. It is, when you can transform something, first of all, you don't keep obsessing about it, because there's no need to obsess about the treatment. You had the treatment, or you have side effects or not. You don't, you know, but it's a totally scary situation. So for some of you who are art therapists, that's why I guess we became art therapists. Even so, I started out working in psychiatry with schizophrenic patients and things like that. I started to work with oncology patients when I had a friend many, many years ago, who went to school with me, who I was in the US and she was still in Switzerland, and she had one of the earliest bone marrow transplant in the world. She had leukemia, and she, at that point, you were in a tent with air, you know, which was clean air. And she said the only thing that would help her, she went with me to art school, would be to do art, but you couldn't get anything in that tent, you know, it had all to be sterilized and stuff, which we did later. But that gave me the idea, if I can do art therapy with psychiatric patients, why shouldn't I be able to do art therapy with people who go through cancer, like you all do, with different population, because it's people come who like to do it, and if they don't like it, they don't come back, so you don't really lose anything. As in your group, some would much prefer to do it through music or through dance or through poetry or writing or poems or whatever, and all is good, and I often try to combine things naturally. But it's a good question. But for others, it's can be dangerous, like your friend. If she starts to do art, then maybe she doesn't focus enough on her family and she feels guilty or something.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
Esther, I
Yes.
was wondering whether, in terms of working personally with people with psychotherapy, and when you're talking about, for you, that kind of national trauma of what is happening for the United States and has been, you know, kind of in the last few years.
Right.
How do you, as you see kind of personal transformation with individuals engaging with art therapy, do you have a sense of collective transformation? If there's a sense that there are some practices that are collectively transformative that can help with collective trauma?
You know, that's a very good question. The problem is when I get these groups, which I don't choose the patients, you know, they just sign up for these things through the hospital. They come in all different political shades. So after I got in trouble, not really nobody said anything, but I could see it in the group, I decided that, especially when certain people are present, that we do not talk about political situations, because it gets very fast, very difficult. But living through it is a consistent trauma. I mean, it's a never-ending trauma since, you know, soon 3 years, soon 4 years. And worse now in this pandemic, you know. And you read the same things as I do. So, but the ones who you can talk to, it's obvious they make art about it. And then when it comes through the art, then it's fine. Then they can say whatever they want. But I learned not to have a discussion about politics, as traumatic as it is, if it comes not through the art.
Sorry, Bill.
No, that's okay.
Sorry. Is there anything that you've seen happen in those last 3 years that you feel has had some collective transformation at all?
I see personal transformation in the patients. There is no question about that. They're more self-confident. I normally have one man who comes for years, but he doesn't have the right computer and the whole thing, so he can't be on Zoom. But I saw a real transformation in him, who was very timid. He didn't try as an engineer. He didn't try anything new, and whatever he did, he was very talented, and he didn't believe it, you know, and I pointed it out, the whole group pointed it out, and he's a totally different man now. And I tell him to hang up his art, and now he takes a writing class, you know, and on and on. I'm sorry, he can't participate now. So personal transformations, people who stay, yes, they do transform. And also now in this COVID thing, you know, people ask me, you know, I want to see my mother, and a young adult person who has, she's most probably in her early 40s, and she lives in a different state. What do you think I should do? You know, these not exactly easy questions. But then the group helps, you know, and the group says, you know, it's not safe yet in the plane. So often I don't really have to say things. These are all professional people, you know. And then once it comes from the group, you know, then it becomes a group discussion. And this person feels whole, you know, she obviously didn't know what to do. She has a wish to see her older mother and the fear she gets the virus on the plane, you know, at the same time. So this, everything is a little more difficult now, and not to talk about race, you know, that is always in the foreground too. How is that with you? Well, how you have a relatively mild situation with COVID-19, do you? Mm-hmm. And how is it with race in Tasmania? Is that the problem or not really? Yes. Mm-hmm. Like what?
Well, there's certainly some other members of the group that could speak more specifically and more clearly to that. But there are, you know, there are large issues of inequalities in Australia that continue, and our leader at the moment, the way he speaks to what it is to be Australian is quite devastating and quite quite destructive. There have been people in this country, you know, in the last decade who've been choosing between food and shelter consistently on a daily basis, and that's been ongoing and certainly not attended to, and certainly isn't spoken about in current narratives about getting back to work and people having taken money, you know, taking money away from people and things like that. It's an ongoing issue. In terms of race, absolutely, you know, systemic racism and ongoing. But there are other members in the group who could certainly speak to that more specifically. But yeah, it's a colonized space, and there's been violence, huge violence around that.
Right. Yes, that's the same here, and the longer the more, you know, and when there is not enough money and not enough jobs or no jobs, everything gets worse, you know, for one group of people or two groups of people.
Yeah, and just
sorry, Bella.
I'm sorry, Bella, you go.
Can I change the topic with my question?
Sure, anybody can change the topic, yes.
I was really interested, you were talking about like jouissance and nowness, and it's a thing lots of people talk about in very different ways. And what I was interested in is a lot of the conversations today has been about bridging the space between some carrying trauma or grief or things around with you. But often when I'm in a room, both personally or facilitating something, I find to play and to be present requires a kind of it requires a confidence and vulnerability in the self to be able, at least in a kind of theatrical sense, to kind of, to find the clown or find the dance, or to write. So I was kind of interested in how that balance exists, kind of in your perception about playing, and also finding the space to be able to play, and you know, that nurturing of, you know, the self coming outwards, which is almost like therapeutic in itself.
Right. No, that's totally true. Yes, it's most probably easier in performance art than it's in art, in visual arts. But yes, I like that. So so I have sometimes really very strange props, or bring stuff, or that people can really get into it. But some people can easier relax and go with the flow, and some other people can less, you know. It's personal, and also in this particular group connected to their own medical situation at a given time, and now on the general, you know, situation on top of it. But yes, I mean, I experienced that myself, that when I have the freedom, when one of the days I don't see patients, I just can do my own thing. I don't really care that I'm alone in a room or anything. I'm totally happy. I mean, even if I throw it away afterwards because it didn't quite turn out as I wanted. But it's just the process, the doing, takes me to another cloud or something, away from what the daily situation is. I think, Simon, you also had a question or something earlier.
Are there any more questions? I want to just mention two things. One was about the volume.
I think Amalia had a question.
Oh, Amalia?
Thanks, Vic. No, I was just going to add to what Catherine was saying about race in Australia and racism, particularly. That's one of the spaces I do a lot of work in. So I was just going to add in that, particularly during COVID, what we're seeing in Australia is a lot of support from the government in a lot of variety of different ways, but particularly people on temporary visas in Australia, they're not eligible for any of those payments. Tasmania is one of the only states that had some kind of support for people on temporary visas or protection visas. It was a one-off payment of $250 for each person, which you can imagine would not go very far, particularly if you're, you know, a lot of the people that I work with are young people from, you know, quite big families. So that's not going to go a particularly far way. So there's a lot of inequalities that I think that this particular time is shining a light on, particularly during this COVID era, and the way that we support people in this time has been really interesting to see, I guess, what the dynamic is at a government and a policy level, but also within the community, because there's tremendous community support in a lot of pockets, but there is that kind of, as Catherine said, really inbuilt kind of systemic issues that we've got here. So I just wanted to add that in as well. Yeah,
that's very important. That's actually the same thing here in huge amount of people. I mean, it's all what most people who are focused would have known before, but now it's there for everybody to see the inequality, and it's not going to change if the administration doesn't change.
I'm interested to know, Esther, hello, how much you might be interested in looking toward children for their approach to therapy, almost like finding a therapeutic approach for themselves. Like if we really pay attention to children and the way they work through things, it can be so unique to childhood or a childlike state. And I wonder what you think about why we ignore them so well when they actually can be our teachers in terms of art therapy or working through, you know, going back to what Bella was saying in regards to play as well. You know, like playfulness has such an incredible ability to bring us right into the moment.
Right.
And often a child will request for us to join them there. And it can be like extracting a tooth, can't it? It's like, Mama, please. And all the things they're not saying, and they can see that you're stuck or that you're not managing to access whatever.
This or that.
Yeah, and I had a really interesting moment yesterday wherein my mum was speaking about my brother and his partner and their baby who they're trying to sleep train. And this was the first time I felt an awareness around this, which was that they were really worried because he's been smiling less this last week. And I thought, well, we mirror each other all the time.
Right.
But, you know, in someone so tiny, he's watching his parents stress at his situation that they're sort of putting one another in, you know, like it's just fascinating. I'm interested in why you feel like, or how you feel we might be able to turn our gaze towards children better.
Yes.
As our educators.
I mean, I worked for many years with children who had cancer in art therapy. Some individually and some in groups. And that was always extremely helpful. And actually, the non-for-profit I worked with, they had a high school student be matched with a younger child who had cancer. So he became like his body. And then together we did art. So that was an incredible, together. The high school student kind of helped facilitate the art for very young children from like maybe 5 up, you know. And yes, you're right. It's very helpful, and I see it also now during this COVID with my grandchildren who are the other end of the country, but how the parents try very hard with the help of the internet and all kinds of things, that after the never-ending Zoom school, that they can do their art and their piano and find new things they haven't done before, because it gets depressive for kids. You know, they can't go out. Now the weather will change a little bit and they will be able to go out, but it's an incredible tool. My advisor in art therapy was Edith Kramer, who was the first one who wrote books about art therapy with children. And if you have a chance to find these books, she is not alive anymore. I'm sure they're around. I think it would be interesting for you to read.
What was the book, sorry?
I think it's called Art Therapy with Children, and her name is Kramer, as in Kramer. That's her first name. Edith.
Thank you.
You just can't put her name into Google, and I'm pretty sure several books come up.
Thank you, Esther. I'm aware we're kind of in a lot of your time. If there are any more questions, now is the time. Otherwise, we did speak about the idea of a provocation for our group. I don't know whether.
Yes, I actually do have one.
I think we'll give us your provocation.
I just give the provocation, not something you do now, but I think it's a good provocation. So there is actually a international internet preservation consortium. And what they do, they collect anything about COVID-19. It's a digital situation, and I can send you the link later. And what the provocation would be is, what is it of your work you would like to have preserved on that, in this archive? It's a digital archive where they ask for people to leave anything which is related to COVID-19. That can be, I'm sure, art or anything, you know, or something which was helpful to you, or a mask or whatever. I thought that's up to date provocation, and can be done at home or anywhere.
Thank you, Esther. We'll take that away with us, and I think everyone will thank me and join me in thanking you for that really great session. Thanks so much. It's been recorded, and we'll put it up on the online for everybody else to see. I'll send it to you first, of course.
Great. Thank you so much for coming, and I wish we had more time to talk.
It's been a
but another time, you all do an amazing kind of works. And this whole situation that you can meet once a month if you choose to is fantastic. We should have something like this here too.
Thanks,
Thank
Esther.
you so much, Simon. Good night.
You.
Oh, good morning.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.